This is the third presentation for week 2, and it covers the French and Indian War and the road to rebellion. The French and Indian War involved two nations, powerful European nations that had a long history of conflict. Prior to the 7 Years' War, of which the French and Indian War was a theater, 3 other wars broke out between these two great nations, and they are listed here. But in 1754, another war broke out, the subject at hand. This time, fighting took place largely on American soil and erupted over a land dispute, namely the Ohio Valley, formed by the Ohio River. And geographically, this is the area of western Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania. As was noted, the French and Indian War was a part of the 7 Years' War between France and England. The whole global war began when a young and inexperienced British officer unwarrantedly ordered an attack on a French military unit in the wilderness of western Pennsylvania. His name was George Washington. The Ohio Valley was of economic and geographical significance, and Virginian and Pennsylvanian fur traders had been going into the area. The French responded, didn't like the British traders coming into the territory, and convinced a number of Native American groups to side with them. And then, so as to ensure French dominance over the Ohio Valley, in 1753, Governor Marquis Duquesne began laying claim to the area by building a number of forts. Indeed, one of the most famous forts was named after Duquesne, and it was located right where the Monongahela River and the Allegheny River, both of them met, forming the Ohio River. Fort Duquesne, which eventually became Fort Pitt, and then Pittsburgh. To rebuff the French establishment of forts and claims to the area, in 1753, young Major Washington was sent with 6 men through thick wilderness to Fort Le Boeuf to give a stern message to the French, and also to spy out French positions and to assess the forks of the Ohio River on behalf of the Ohio Company. Washington was born in 1732, so he was about 21 years old at this time, and was already active in the vicinity of Winchester, Virginia, which was really the frontier town at the time. He had been employed since the age of 16 as a surveyor for Lord Fairfax. On this mission, young Washington was accompanied by Christopher Gist, a famous frontiersman who had settled far away in the wilderness on the western frontier of Pennsylvania. However, not far from Fort Le Boeuf, Washington was discovered and escorted to the fort by French soldiers. The French at Fort Le Boeuf were gracious hosts. They wined and dined their guests for 48 hours and even provided them with food and liquor for the return trip. Washington then returned with a letter for Virginia Governor Dinwiddie. The return trip was indeed treacherous, and Gist is noted for saving Washington's life. Upon noting the French refusal to leave, Dinwiddie and the House of Burgesses sent now 22-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Washington with 186 men to take on the French in the frontier. After encamping at a place called the Great Meadows in western Pennsylvania, Washington received word from Gist that 50 French soldiers were on the way. He devised a surprise attack that would involve assistance from the Seneca. Furling notes what took place. Just as day was breaking on May 28th, the campfires of their prey were spotted. Creeping closer, Washington discovered that the French, who had posted no guards, were making breakfast. He ordered his men to encircle the Frenchmen, while the Senecas formed an outer ring. The Indians were to deal with any enemy soldier who succeeded in escaping through the English line. When all was ready, he screamed the order to open fire. The French never had a chance. Taken by surprise, they were victims of a massacre. And among the dead was the commander, Jumonville. Washington read the papers that he found on Jumonville's body. His counterpart had not been leading a war party, he had been bringing a message to the English. Jumonville, in fact, had been sent on a mission precisely like that which had taken Washington to Fort Le Boeuf 6 months earlier. In the immediate aftermath of his ambush, Washington was beset with anxiety, and with good reason. Having ordered a hostile act against a peaceful party, he had considerably stretched Dinwiddie's elastic orders. Apprehensive, young Washington turned to damage control. He wrote the governor that the French he had killed were really spies of the worst sort, cautioning Dinwiddie not to be duped by whatever smooth stories were spun by the score or more prisoners he was sending back to Williamsburg. The captives ought to be hanged, he told the chief executive. Some of the ambushed French managed to get back to Fort Duquesne, and Washington knew that he was a marked man. He then retreated to the Great Meadows and called the fortification Fort Necessity, and reinforcements arrived. But Fort Necessity was ill-planned, being on low ground and within shooting distance of the woods. When the French retaliatory force arrived, of about 900 men, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. The horses were quickly destroyed, 25% of the Virginia regiment killed or wounded, and Washington was forced to surrender to Jumonville's brother on July 4th, 1754. Washington and his men were free to go after Washington signed off that Jumonville had actually been murdered. Washington will later say that because he did not read French, he did not understand what he was signing. Beyond that, I find it interesting that Washington ended up purchasing the Great Meadows area and holding it for a while. Here is Fort Necessity. It has been rebuilt for historical purposes, but it is in the exact same place and is built to the best knowledge of what it looked like. If you go to the next slide, you'll get a closer view of it. The next year, in 1755, England decided to send approximately 7,000 British troops to the colonies. A beautiful area. To deal with the French beautiful day that and day. Their Native American allies. With my children. Here are my two research assistants. Infamous on the next slide. British attempts to do this, and please note how known tiny as Braddock's this defeat. Fort is. Braddock was. They are 9 years old here. To lead the earthworks at the base to follow up the fort. It can still be seen where it's raised Washington up a little bit had been sent previously to do the French. And the goal was to take Fort Duquesne, the tiny little headquarters. In the process, Washington's men was killed. Had no chance at all. It was a poorly chosen place. In fact, the memorial to Braddock, you'll see on right the slide with my children on it. Necessity. A sign. Here is Furling's account of Braddock's defeat. Washington was present. Two very young men named Daniel Boone and Daniel Morgan were also present. And I'll leave it to you to go ahead and read this account. Eventually, the British got the upper hand on the French and ultimately were able to cut off French supply ships to the Americas, destroying the French ability to wage war in the colonial area. The most decisive victory of the war came in 1759 at the Battle of Quebec, where General James Wolfe heroically captured the city of Quebec from General Louis Joseph de Montcalm. The war would drag on until 1763, when both the 7-Year War, including the French and Indian War, came to an end via the Peace of Paris. This slide notes the Albany Congress that occurred just before the outbreak of the French and Indian War at Great Meadows. It is important because it was the first real move to unite the colonies in some way, and Benjamin Franklin was a leading participant. It's not a move for independence, but along with the Great Awakening, became an impetus for the colonies to unite in some way. Having curtailed a new war with the Indians along the frontier, George III now looked to replenish his treasury. He reasoned that since the war was fought so as to protect the colonists, then they should bear the responsibility of paying off the war debt via taxation. But the colonists didn't like that, of course. Now we move to events that will cause a great rift between the colonists and the ruling authority in England. The French and Indian War, along with the 3 wars which preceded it, had taken a major toll on British finances, and they were in desperate need of both a lasting peace and additional incoming revenues. So as to ensure the peace, King George III signed the Proclamation Act of 1763, which forbade the colonists from migrating west of the Appalachian Mountains, because when they did that, they created problems, tensions with the Native Americans. First came the Sugar Act in 1754, when it was enforced. And this slide gives some information about the Sugar Act. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765. This act was widely unpopular, and the colonists noted that they were being taxed without representation. The Stamp Act was debated among the colonists, and a dramatic shift began to take place in the colonies, predominantly in Boston. And I note here the 2 sides involved. There are the Loyalists, or Tories, who are loyal to the Crown, and revolutionaries, or the Sons of Liberty, who were reacting against the Crown. Additionally, there was the Quartering Act of 1765. As you can see, the taxes and the declarations came rapidly in succession, fanning the flames of discontent. In 1767, the British passed another set of taxes known as the Townshend Acts, wherein glass and paint and other goods were taxed. Eventually, the British sent troops into Boston to kind of quell the dissent. By March 1770, the presence of British troops became too much for the colonials in Boston, and on the night of March 5th, outside the Customs House, located near the center of Boston, the first serious violent act of aggression took place, namely the Boston Massacre. After the Boston Massacre, relations between the Crown of England and the colonists grew to a boiling point. Within 3 years, the colonists would make one final move which would push King George III to his breaking point. In 1773, on December 16th, was the Boston Tea Party, wherein the Sons of Liberty, under the direction of Samuel Adams, a cousin of John Adams, dumped chests of tea into Boston Harbor. And by the next year, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. A total of 55 delegates from every colony except Georgia